intertwines with the inexplicable, where the boundaries of reason dissolve into the shadows of uncertainty. Welcome to the Political Twilight Zone. I am your guide through this enigmatic labyrinth, where politics and power take on life of their own. In this dimension, the threads of truth weave a tapestry of intrigue, challenging our perception of the world we thought we knew. In this world, nothing is as it seems, and the truth lies buried beneath layers of deceit. Prepare to venture where reason meets the unexplained, and where the unexplained might just be.
Hello, folks. Thanks for joining us again here on KNZZ KGLN, the internet, podcasting, and probably in deep space someplace. At least that's where my imagination goes. Thanks for joining us here again. Where I'm at, it's a wet weekend. Hopefully it doesn't get wet to the point where it gets above our knees here. That's a bad thing to think about there. Some of our great drainage in the area, I've noticed, is not really taking place, but that's beside the point. So, Trump didn't win the Nobel Peace Prize. Duh. How many people out there thought he was going to? I mean, a group of pacifist Swedes get together and award something to a person who generally supports the status quo of what goes on in Europe and places like that. Does that sound anything like Donald Trump? No. It's not really about bringing peace. It's about keeping the right things in the right spots. Remember, and I know you've heard this a million times by now, but, Barack Obama got the Nobel Peace Prize just before he took office. He hadn't done anything. And he managed to maintain that record throughout his administration. The only people he really did anything to was us. Yeah, that's right. Anyway, there was some talk this week when we were talking about some of these, just one crazy thing after another that goes on with violence lately. And, I think, was it Cory Booker? No, it was Van Jones that was saying, well, the media is so selective in how it reports these things. Well, what he was talking about at that time was wrong, but the idea isn't. It's so frustrating to have things happening in the world that don't get talked about. We have plenty of time to talk about them. We have 24-hour news all the time. Why don't we talk about them? I don't know. I complain about it all the time. It doesn't seem to change. But I do try and bring some things to people's attention. Oh, by the way, the Nobel Peace Prize, and I'm sure many of you know this, was established by Alfred Nobel. Now, what did Alfred Nobel invent? Yes, that's right. I hear you folks out there. Dynamite. Yes, he invented dynamite, and he was a little shocked at how destructive it was. So he decided that he would take some of the profits from making his dynamite and have a peace prize for people who would try and bring order to the world. And then as time went by, they were expanded out to various other sorts of, literature and I think pogo stick jumping. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but there's a lot of them. And so that's how that all started. And, of course, we know how it ended up. I mean, can anybody take that stuff seriously anymore? Now, if somebody wins like the Nobel Prize for Physics or something, I'm at least interested in it. But that's still political, too. Anyway, that being said, I just want to talk about some of the things that have happened in the last few years that I thought were pretty serious that barely got talked about. Mass violence, all sorts of things, structural failures, who knows what. Some of you may remember in Nigeria, the Boko Haram. Remember that Bring Our Girls Home thing? They've been raging a pretty nasty campaign since, about 2009, targeting just pretty much anybody that gets in the way. Civilians, schools, villages, chickens crossing the road, just anything. They're really, kind of just an equal opportunity militia, and not a friendly one. In 2024, they attacked a place in Yobe State, killing around 130 villagers in a wave of shootings, arson, and massed violence. Did anybody hear? I don't remember hearing anything about that. They also had a recent IED attack on civilian vehicles between Ran and Gamboru. I'm sorry, I don't know exactly where that is. That killed like 26 people. It didn't really come up anywhere. Those things are, let's face it, do they affect us daily? Not exactly, but they do give you a sense of what's going on around the world, and it helps you to understand that what's happening in some of these places is not as localized as we think. The world is kind of on fire in many places, and it helps us to see that it isn't just Chicago that this kind of stuff is going on. The other one I thought was just crazy that happened in Azerbaijan, right? Armenians have not had a great chance to, get ahead in Azerbaijan. They regained control, I don't know, I want to say about 8 or 9 years ago, no longer than that. And they just deported about 120,000, 150,000 Armenians living there. Nobody said a word. No, nothing like the genocide in Gaza. No, nobody really had anything to say about that. They lost their homes. They removed. There was ethnic cleansing under many definitions, frankly. Coverage of it by the media was reframed as geopolitical conflict rather than humanitarian disaster. Yeah, just sort of an interesting thing. And right here in 2025, let us not forget, we talked about this a little bit, this India-Pakistan flare-up, what's the right way to call it. As many of you know, India and Pakistan have not gotten along for a very long time. And they had sort of a little mini-war that broke out in the early part of 2025. And, Trump kind of got involved and tried to settle it down. But I remember wondering, well, what started? Well, there were some terrorist attacks. And the next thing, there was some military exchanges. And while the media in both those countries had coverage, it was just a footnote every place else because we were so interested in Ukraine or, at that point, Gaza a little bit. But remember, unlike Ukraine or Gaza per se, India and Pakistan are both nuclear powers. So we usually pay a little more attention to that. Apparently not, because it wasn't part of the narrative. And these things get neglected because just understand it's a geopolitical strategic interest. Is it going to affect us directly here? Some of these, no. Now, nuclear exchange probably would between Pakistan and India. But we still don't get a very general picture of the world when people don't get reported on things like this. And if we're not careful, we think that all the craziness is just happening here. Now, I'm not sure if it makes us feel any better to find out that it's happening in a lot of places, but at least it doesn't make it seem so localized and that we're not the only people dealing with the problem. Plus, you realize that there's things going on that could escalate into situations that do affect us. As we know, we're no longer able to just sort of sit here in island America and go about our business. There's some things that we have to be involved in faraway places. A good example of that is Friday, President Trump, because he was upset with China, said he was thinking about really high 100, 125% tariffs on them and this and that. Of course, that's sent the stock market into a tailspin and did not do any of your 401ks any good because China has so much trade with the United States. Also, there's this continuing concern about semiconductors and high-tech stuff, some of which comes from China, but most of which comes from Taiwan. I want to say that about 98% of the semiconductor basic industry, the production of basic semiconductors, comes from Taiwan. Now, how we let that happen, I don't know. I suspect it's because we priced ourselves out of the market. And we also probably went nuts in a couple of these administrations on the factories to build semiconductor industries and silicon and stuff like that. And so they just moved someplace else. And Taiwan wanted it. They needed an industry, and they've done very well with it. But it's all sort of that all your eggs in one basket thing. If something were to happen to Taiwan tomorrow, like if we get blockaded by China, let's say, we would be in real trouble almost immediately. Some of you may remember when we had the chip shortage during the pandemic. Some of the chips that went into things like making automobiles, things like that. When that started, it was amazing how many things just kind of ground to a halt. We are so reliant on that kind of technology and that kind of trade that it isn't until it stops that we know the problem. So when you're dealing with China, who's always trying to mess around with Taiwan, and don't forget they are messing around with the Philippines too quite a bit, which also doesn't get reported, then would have an enormous effect on us, at least, well, short term. Now, we're trying to bring some of that semiconductor industry home to the United States, but we're going to have some changes in the way we conduct business because some of the things that we did is what ran them off to begin with. So we need to look at why they're not here now, not just try and make them come back or start here, whatever the case may be. We need to know why a lot of these places left and what can we do to ameliorate that so that maybe they'll want to come back because we need them here, not all the way across the Pacific. Okay, folks, we're back. This is Rick Wagner getting it right again, and you can visit my website for a lot of these kinds of stories and so forth all over the place. We try and get a lot of feeds in, so you can have kind of one-stop shopping there at therickWagnerShow.com. And you can get us also by thewaronwrong.com and some of our other nom de plumes we've had over the years. But we have a lot of good feeds in there. And then occasionally I put things in the center that I think are important, or once in a while when, I don't know what seizes me, but I'll write something and stick in there. And frankly, some of you folks have been nice enough to have a lot of you read that, so I appreciate it. But nevertheless, let's move on to a couple other things. I mean, I try and cover things that don't seem to be getting very well covered other places, and it doesn't mean they're not important. We're just talking about that. And one of the things that troubles me is this technology gap that we seem to be letting happen between ourselves and others. I don't know if it's because our politicians are dumber than the others. It's possible. My guess is it's just because they're not focused enough. They're worried about things that maybe aren't that important, but they think they are. One example of that is look at the answer, and some of you have seen this in the race for governor in Virginia. Abigail Spanberger, who has perfected the effect of just talking around a direct question. Now, this is not easy. She was asked if she would repeal Governor Youngkin's ban on people who are not biologically configured for the restrooms that they're using, that they had to use the ones that they were biologically configured on, no matter what they were thinking. So they wanted to know if she would repeal that if she was elected governor. She was asked that at least 3 times that I heard it directly because they weren't going to let it go. She would not answer it. Her answers were so circular that if you listened to them more than once, you got a little dizzy. She just kept saying over and over again in the first 2 answers that, well, I stand for working with local school boards. And I mean, that was had nothing to do with the question. And when they really pressed her on the 3rd time, the closest she could get to it was essentially saying that, well, this ought to be a local problem that takes. It's not a local problem. Being a local problem was the problem to begin with. Remember the Loudoun County school districts and this and that, or various school districts close to D.C., they decided they were the most woke things on the planet, and the parents of children that were going there didn't necessarily agree. So that sort of thing wasn't really working well. And it's a shame that you have to have someone like Governor Youngkin or anybody, that you have to pass legislation for things like that. Can you imagine if you went back, and I don't mean going back in time a long ways, I'm just going to say 1993. Let's just pick that number. Do you think that if you told people what we were arguing about now when it comes to transgenders and bathroom use and athletics and things like that, that it would be a major issue? I'll bet even people who were pretty middle of the road and kind of liberal would think, no, these things they're just easy to figure out. I mean, that's just not right. But the Democrats have hitched their wagon to this falling star, and they're going to ride it all the way down. Their base, as near as they can tell, and this is, I think, a problem with their own polling and their understanding of things outside of some of these city centers, is that they think it's absolutely crucial that they hold on to this 1% of the United States that is really tied up into some of these issues. And once again, I think it's an 80-20 thing. I think if they could take a step back far enough, they would see that, maybe 20% of their constituents go along with that, about 80% don't like it. But they're so afraid now of the far left. It's really an interesting thing. They know intuitively that their party isn't just made up of left-wing, far-left wackos that are really not Democrats at all. They just happen to vote that way, apparently. Well, they, once in a while anyway, when they are voting and not burning something down. So they're so worried about that they're just letting the other things go. And I mean, frankly, if you just from political standpoints, let them go. Let them do that, that's the boulder they're tying themselves to and then jumping in the water. But it's certainly not good for politics. When all you do is spend time arguing over what are essentially absurdities, that's not helpful in government. Government has enough trouble getting forward without getting caught up in any more nonsense than it generates itself. And now we have a number of issues that really don't have anything to do with governance or anything to do with protecting the citizenry, for instance, providing for a good economy, making sure that your roads are there if you want to use them, cops are there when you want to call them, that kind of thing. We're just been steering away from that. Now, we're trying to go back that direction from the Republican side and Trump and some of his people. And frankly, it's a winning number. People have had enough in some of these places. I think it's hard to understand how much of a problem crime is in some of these cities, and in particular some parts of these cities. Now, when you say that, you get somebody like, the round beach ball, J.B. Pritzker, that wants to go out and film like the nicest part of town in the early morning and say, look, there's no crime here. Yeah, well, J.D., if everybody could live like you, in other words, live off your family's money and then not have to go anywhere that's nasty, yeah, I think life would probably seem a little bit different to them. But that's not the case. And so you have him doing that. You have the same thing going on with the mayor. I mean, here's the question that I know I've asked this before. But is it possible to be dumber than Brandon Johnson, the mayor of Chicago? I mean, really? Has he said anything that makes any kind of sense anymore? Does he live entirely in his head, and in his head there's like some sort of play going on that we all don't really see? Because the things he talks about either aren't happening or don't make any sense anyway. And yet, he was elected to the mayor of one of the largest cities in the United States. And it's being run just exactly as you would expect, into the ground, hard. And it's not going to get better until someone like that's gone, and the people that he appoints are gone. But it's not going to be a while. I mean, watch your news feeds from some of these cities. Now, I'm talking about how we need to have more information about things outside of our, hyper focus we get on things. But nevertheless, we still have to be aware of some of the things that are happening at home. And you don't need to hear or see it 100 times to know that things are completely out of control, and that Antifa really is a sort of militia. This is the thing that's interesting. If conservatives got together and did anything and gave themselves a name, they are a radical terrorist group, or a militia that's trying to overthrow the government. If these guys get together, dress alike, have their own flag, seem to be getting well-financed from somebody, show up very violently, let's face it, they've gotten more violent, not less, and are extremely well-organized in terms of they just appear out of nowhere. Now, some of that's social media. And yet, they're not a problem. The right tries to label them as a terrorist organization. Yeah, and they are. If you go back to the 60s and you want to talk about the Weather Underground, I guess some of the people I see protesting Trump look on those days with sort of nostalgia, right? When they were young baby boomers and they were out there with long hair protesting everything, and they just look back and imagine things were different. It's sort of like all these people in that sort of genre that were imagine that they were at Woodstock, and most of them were not. They'll tell you, oh, Woodstock. No, you weren't. And the fact that you think you were is troubling. But this is what's going on. And we're being kind of pushed in a direction that is, Victor Davis Hanson calls it sort of a neo-confederacy. I think that's very true, is that so many of the things that the cities, these big blue cities are saying are, and a lot of people talk about this, are essentially states' rights arguments that were made by the Confederacy. Now, we do have states' rights. These are, of course, ignored when Democrats are in charge of the government. But when they're not in charge of the government, they're very important. And I guess it makes sense because let's remember where the problems were and what party most of these people were part of from the Civil War. Yeah, they were Democrats. And let's remember that the first Republican president was Abraham Lincoln. And they don't like to think about that. They don't want to remember George Wallace standing in the doorway and the schools, the high schools, to one in particular, to bar, it being segregated, it being integrated. Sorry, they don't remember any of that. And if they did, it was somehow he was some kind of fascist that who knows what party he was from. Yeah, and so that's what you're struggling against. Because of that, there's this blind eye that gets turned to so many of these things because it's not convenient for the narrative. You guys know that. But it is a bit of a neoconservative, neoconservative. Huh. We have plenty of neocons out there. It is a sort of a neo-confederacy in terms of their ideas. Now, do they want to withdraw from the United States? That's what makes them different. That's what sets them apart. Oh, no. They want the United States to continue to service them. Money, resources, you name it. They're not interested in going their own way. They want the rest of the country to go their way. That's different than trying to form your own country. Okay, folks, we're back. Third segment here. I know I let my bumpers go on a long time. That's because I like them. I mean, I like them for various different kinds of reasons. And so, when they're on, it kind of gets me in the mood. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that what's ever going on in the bumper is exactly what I'm thinking about, but it kind of gets me, going there. And I hope it's, gets your attention to say, hey, what's going on? Maybe that sounds kind of interesting. And we, of course, have the most eclectic bumper music. I have here, let's see, the theme from the Superman cartoons from the 60s, the Underdog cartoons from the late 70s and early 80s, and then I have, of course, a theme song from Paladin, and let's see, Secret Agent Man, and then we go all the way back up to Talking Heads, and all kinds, because the genres help represent just different ideas. And if it was well done, even if it's something you're not crazy about, you have to say, well, it's well done. Anyway, so what I want to talk about this segment is, let's see, it's not any of this stuff that I'm seeing on the news right now, because you guys get plenty of that. What I want to talk about again was space. That's right. Space, the final frontier. These are the voyages of the starship Maga, going forth to see what it can find, any sort of, kind of, even marginally intelligent life out there. And the reason I bring that up is because a couple of stories caught my eye this week, and so I did a little bit more research in it. And the more you look into what's going on in the space programs with China and Russia, the more troubling it becomes. And the more indicative it is of course, one of the dangers in a society like ours. The more complex your society becomes, the more integrated it becomes in various tools. And I'm talking about technology at this point. Cell phones, GPS, self-driving cars, anything that you're trying to see that wasn't here 20 years ago even. And this has happened very quickly. You don't have to sound like somebody sitting around the Cracker Barrel when you're talking about how fast this has gone from where cell phones were something that cost you a lot of money and they charge you per minute to something that everybody has in their pocket and has some sort of assistant in it that is smarter than you are. This has not happened very slowly, but it's made us dependent on things that we barely understand. And the dependency is dangerous. And some of it is not necessary, and it still makes it dangerous because we've decided to be reliant on it. Try and imagine if tomorrow, wherever you're at, in like a 20-mile circumference of where you're at, somebody just turned off all of the cell phones. All the towers went down. Boop. What do you think would happen? I'm not sure either. I don't see it as being good. There was a time where nobody had those kinds of things, and they were able to communicate pretty well. Now, some of that's changed because we're so dependent on our cell phones that the landline idea is kind of disappeared. There's still landlines out there, of course. And I did read, by the way, that some people with kids now are turning back to landlines so they kind of control what goes on with their conversations and how late they're up and stuff like that. But I just saw that little story. But it wasn't that long ago that we were able to communicate, we were able to plan, we were able to do things like that without some of the technology. For instance, if you went shopping at the mall, remember those, and you had an agreement to meet at a certain point at a certain time. Now, that was important because you could not communicate with each other during that time when you were shopping. And if you didn't remember what time it was and we were supposed to meet, then you might have to walk home. Now, people are much more cavalier about where they're at, what they're doing, when they show up, all this kind of stuff, because they figure, well, I can just text somebody. I mean, we've moved past talking to them, and now we're just texting them. Pretty soon we'll just be drawing like cave drawings on our phones and sending them to people. But so that dependency has made us extremely vulnerable. If something happens to our cellular network, which isn't hard to disrupt, by the way, it's population. Is the military and things like that going to be as affected? Not directly, but the chaos that would probably happen because of that would certainly affect them and their ability to project battle readiness and things like that. And beyond that, we also rely on, and we've talked about this several times because I just like people to be aware of it, we rely on a lot of things that are, in fact, in space. Our GPS system is not in our phones. It doesn't live in the dashboard of our cars. Those are just receivers, and that help pinpoint with the geoprecision that comes from a satellite overhead that tell us where we're at, how we get someplace, is there a road here, stuff like that. Because we are dependent on that and, of course, what goes on with them. Well, maps. We're always hearing these stories, some of which are funny, some of which are tragic, about people that, drive off the side of something because Google Maps or Apple Maps or something like that was, if not exactly wrong, but highly misleading about what's the best path somewhere. In the past, people would get a little suspicious if they were starting to, we're trying to go into the city, and yet I seem to be going down this rocky road towards, I don't know, is it a cliff up there? But the Jeep, the VAT navigation system says to just keep on because it's a shortcut into town. We would be less gullible for that, but we've become so reliant on it that we're not. We're just like, oh, yeah, well, I'm sure it knows what it's doing. Most of the time, maybe it does. But we no longer have a check on that. We don't no matter automatically want to make sure that what we're doing is correct because we assume that technology is making things correct for us. That's not good thinking. So all of these things become interdependent. And like I said, the more complex a society, the easier it is to disrupt. Now, you didn't have to ride into, say, a 17th century village and take away everybody's cell phones because they didn't have any. And so it was difficult to disrupt them without going in there and physically disrupting them. Well, we don't have that luxury anymore. We can be disrupted from a great distance. And because so much of this stuff is in space, or parts of what it does is in space, then we forget about what's overhead. Look what happened with the GPS and cellular experience in Ukraine. The Russians knocked that out early on. And so people had really no internet. Their communication system was extremely limited. And it took, Elon Musk agreed to send the Starlink satellites over Ukraine and allow those people to use them to get access to the internet and stuff like that. Because that's what they do. But without that, it would have been very difficult for the Ukrainians. That was a major thing, which Elon doesn't get a whole lot of credit now because people chosen to forget about that. But that just shows you how easily things are disrupted. I mean, that happened early on in the Ukraine conflict because people understand how important that kind of stuff has become. So we have those kinds of satellites. We have communication satellites who are bouncing signals off. The day of running a tape of an interview from London to New York on a ship or a plane or something, those are days that were done a long time ago. Many of you remember the Telstar satellite? Yeah, one of the first telecommunication satellites. They bounced signals off that, and I think they had like some really cool like programs that came up and said, look at this, we're talking live to people in Europe. Which things we take for granted. We assume that it's easy to talk to somebody that's strolling around in Kabul on their cell phone when you're in Des Moines. We think that's the way it is. No, it hasn't been that way. And the fact that you can do that makes you rely upon that kind of communication too much. There are some pluses to it. One of the things is it's nice for people in the military to be able to communicate with their family. Remember, World War II, Korea too, and even into Vietnam, although I think the mail was a little better, but people might be out of touch from their loved ones for months. And communications from them to the soldiers, sailors, and Marines had to follow them around. And many times, people who were sending communications to their loved ones that were in the military had no idea where they were, except maybe the Pacific or North Africa. This isn't really narrowing it down. So the idea that you can speak to somebody live, see their face, hear their voice, half a world away, is just expected now. They have trouble in the military to make sure that people don't give away where they're at, because it might be, maybe it's not a good idea to let other people know where our military installations are at. Not that they probably don't know anyway, the way the world goes, but nevertheless, that is a big help. I mean, it makes the deployment much less solitary. But it also makes us have high expectations, and the expectations are that kind of thing is going to be around all the time. And, of course, it's not. If there were a kinetic action, as we like to call it, that kind of stuff would stop. If there's a real battle, a serious battle going on, there's not going to be much person-to-person communication between troops and families because, one, they're not going to want to use that time and bandwidth to do that right away. And secondly, it's pretty hard to transmit anything if they blow up all the towers and or if they're trying to triangulate where you're at when you're using your equipment. Also not a good idea. So we've kind of slid past that. Now in space, as I keep trying to get back to it, we've sort of went slack. We put satellites up, and by we I mean Elon Musk. I mean, satellites are mainly put up now by private companies. They're not put up by NASA. NASA was much too concerned about DEI and trying to get an Islamist somewhere on a space shuttle. I mean, that was pretty much their whole job for a long time. So most of it is still privately launched. And satellites that do all sorts of things. The orbit around the planet, and there's several different layers of those orbits, because the speed in which you orbit changes based on the distance you are from the planet. Because the closer in you are, the faster you have to orbit to keep from getting pulled into the gravity well. So there's essentially several layers out there. And they're just chock full of stuff. It's bad enough that there's a lot of junk out there now anyway. There are satellites that have quit functioning, that are just still roaming around up there. Those that got knocked apart by some sort of space debris, and just the pieces are still falling around. There's a lot of that stuff up there. We're putting a lot of junk up around our planet. That being said, we rely on a lot of that stuff. Now, some of our, competitors, let's call them, let's say Russia, has got some really interesting going on. They have launched the fewest amount of orbital, suborbital types of expeditions since 1961. That was the year Yuri Gagarin went up, right? They're very diminished now. They had 8 orbital launches in 2025 so far versus like 100 by the U.S. However, what they're launching is very interesting. we think that like 3 of those 8 launches were anti-satellite weapons because we see what their priority is. Yeah, we can't put as much stuff up there, but what we can put up there is stuff that we can use to get rid of your stuff. So that advantage will not really be what it was. They can't afford to go to Mars, but they can afford to go after our satellites. There's one that's called the Cosmos 2588 that we know about. It's called the Stalker satellite. And they launched one from, Plastek, north of Moscow. I guess about the 23rd of May we know about this. And this satellite, that we think is a Stalker satellite, immediately started being in orbit close to USA, 338, which is a optical spy satellite that's the size of a bus. Just a coincidence. The Stalker satellite doesn't seem to be doing anything. It's apparently waiting for some kind of signal to do something. Now, as we've said before, remember that things in orbit are very delicate usually. We think of them as being pretty tough because, they get launched into space and so forth. Well, some of the containers are, but once you're up there, the amount of money it takes to get a pound of something into orbit is really high. So everything that goes into orbit is as lightweight as possible. Now, lightweight most of the time means they're more vulnerable. Solar arrays, antennas, the construct of them themselves. So if you launch something that is essentially aggressive, that isn't wasting a lot of its time trying to do something useful, but instead can do things like, fire off little missiles, get close to satellites and have a grappling arm come out and tear them apart. It's pretty kind of sci-fi, but these things are out there. And so if you can't beat somebody in their technology, maybe you can, with a lot less effort, get rid of their technology. And Russia's been very interested in that. Luckily, we know a little bit more about it, but they think that like this last thing that went up is a kinetic anti-satellite weapon. That it either is itself designed to get a little extra bit of propulsion at the right time and fly into satellites, or that it may have the capability to fire something from it. But the easiest thing to do is just ram stuff. Now, remember, this spy satellite might be the size of a bus, but you could probably punch your hand right through it because there'd be some equipment in there. But for the most part, it's as light as possible. Now, Russia has this project called Nivelir, and it is their satellite inspection program. And what they're doing with it is they're just inspecting satellites. There's nothing to it, nothing to see here. Look the other way. They send us up in some of these very small launches they do now. And their story for why these satellites get so close to ours and Great Britain's and so forth is because they're inspecting them, just to see what's going on. Well, what does that mean? I mean, when a satellite starts tailgating yours at like 17,000 miles an hour, that's not curiosity. That's surveillance, and probably with a little malice, right? And you can have satellites like this that are inside of satellites. They call them space dolls. Russian dolls, those things where you keep taking the doll apart and there's a smaller and smaller and smaller one. Yeah. Well, they have some satellites like that, and we call them space dolls. In 2019, one of their satellites we were able to detect ejected a mini satellite that fired a projectile. A year later, by the way, it popped this little mini satellite out of itself in 2019, and in 2020 we found it fired a projectile. We don't know what it hit. Probably was a test, sort of a warning shot, right? So they're trying to turn that into a shooting gallery up there because it costs a whole lot less for them to destroy our stuff than it does for them to catch back up with us. To say nothing about just eavesdropping, spying. Our networks are so large, and we try and keep them sophisticated, that just loitering near these communication satellites, we think that remember the old Russian trawlers that used to be off the coast of the United States? The Russian trawlers are out there, and they have all this, informationally spy gear up on there. But there's fishing. They're not doing it. Well, this is what this has turned into. They're just listening and looking when they're not up there waiting to destroy something. And let's see, there's an example. I don't have one now. In 2024, in March, there is one of their satellites called Luch 2 approach communication satellite, and Ukrainian transmissions were suddenly jammed. That's what a coincidence that was. Even some of the people we have in the Pentagon then didn't think that was the case. And we believe that Russia may be developing a nuclear anti-satellite weapon, essentially a space bomb that could wipe out thousands of satellites at once. So what you think about is, we say, yay, we're way ahead of these guys. They can't catch up because, they're fighting in Ukraine and they're poor. But there are some things they can do to eliminate our advantage that they are capable of. This is one of them. It's incredibly irresponsible. We don't know exactly what would happen, but some sort of nuclear detonation in orbit could theoretically take out hundreds of satellites. Not only the ones that are immediately around it, but the shock wave that would come out from the explosion and so forth in that orbital pattern would disable most of them, because once again, they're fragile. It's what's called, let's see, a Kessler cascade, debris rendering space unusable for decades, because what it didn't blow up right away itself, in terms of disabling, those things would be vulnerable to the stuff it did blow up that's still orbiting around up there. So not only does it blow up and destroy a bunch of things, but the things that get destroyed stay in orbit as little pieces that no longer function for anything except to get in the way of other things and destroy them. That could shut down our GPS, communications, banking, weather forecasting, all that stuff. China's kind of doing the same thing. Their satellite network program's grown by 500% since 2015. And a couple of the satellites that we have seen that they've launched have literally grabbed and moved other satellites, saying that they could clean up some of their orbital assets. Really? Huh. It's sort of what some of the people call dogfighting in space, sort of by proxy. They're just not exploring space. They're like the Soviets, I don't know why I keep doing that. They're so much the same, actually. Just like the Russians is, they're trying to take our advantage away. Now, they'd like to surpass us, but in the meantime, you don't have to work as hard to surpass somebody if you're taking out half their stuff. Now, we're trying to fight back. France, interestingly enough, is developing what they call bodyguard satellites. These are orbital escorts for high-value assets. And the EU has been studying those too. Of course, the United States has been studying that stuff as well. But that's what's going on around us. We're not hearing that kind of thing, but it's a very serious issue. And it's very much on the mind of people when you start looking at some of the defense publications and things like that. Because the more we depend on some of this stuff for, locating, tracking, sending out missiles, Tomahawk missiles, and so forth, where they get GPS, even hardened GPS, eliminated, it gets crazy. So pay attention out there to some of this stuff. It's not only interesting, but we need to pay more attention.
Thanks for listening. Listen, if you'd like to listen to more and you want to maybe perhaps have someone else listen to our podcast, you can do so either by going right to our webpage, politicalviking.com, or therickWagnerShow.com. Both of them take you there. You can get links right directly to our podcast, or you can hear our podcast on Podbean, on iTunes, and Spotify, and a couple others. So you can find us. We appreciate it if you do. And if you've heard the show, you want somebody else to hear it, that's a good way to send it to them. Thanks for listening.